The Netherlands Atlantic Association, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here at Pulgi. My name is Paul Bril. Usually, public meetings organized by the Atlantic Associations are about managing international dispute, containing conflicts and crises, preventing war. This meeting is about war, about the war of aggression that is raging on European soil, less than 2,000 kilometers from here. A war that confronts us with a degree of destruction and ugliness which we thought was banned from our continent. A war that reminds us of what Dwight Eisenhower said, "Under the clouds of war, it is humanity hanging on a cross of iron." All of you are, in one way or another, involved in international affairs, so I don't have to waste time with a full history of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict or an extensive introduction of all the issues that are involved in this war. We'll try to zoom in on the most pressing questions. What sort of challenge are we really dealing with in Ukraine? In other words, what are the root causes of Vladimir Putin's aggression and how far is he willing to go? How do Russia and Ukraine perform on the battlefield? How long can the West sustain the policy of military and economic aid to Ukraine? Should the West, at a certain point, agree to new borders in favor of Russia? How will the war affect transatlantic relations and the state of the world in the long run? If this sounds a little bit like a hodgepodge to you, don't worry. We have two eminent speakers who will sort it all out. Let me introduce them to you. First, Robert Adolph. He is a military strategist with a real military background. He served in the US Army's Special Forces and in several intelligence units. He worked for the United Nations in the Middle East, Asia, and at the UN headquarters in New York. Most recently, he served as a consultant team leader in support of the OSCE in Ukraine. Our second speaker is Tony van der Tocht. He is a senior associate fellow at the Russia and Eastern Europe Center at the Klingendahl Institute here in The Hague. He is the author of several publications on Dutch-Russian bilateral relations, Russian foreign policy, and Russia-EU relations. The order of the meeting is as follows. Both speakers will give a presentation of about 20 minutes. And after that, there will be a Q&A in which you, the audience, can participate. And we draw the curtain at 7 o'clock, not later. Now, without further ado, please welcome Robert Adolph.
I've been told by just about everybody to stick with the 20 minutes. So, and those of you who've taken your jackets off, again, I thank you, and you in the shorts. Bram, please, sometime in the future, let me make a presentation in shorts. Okay, I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, share my thoughts. Thanks to Bram, thanks to Gerben. Gerben's my editor at Atlantic Perspectives magazine. We've been working together now for almost 2 years. Both have been supportive and generous with their time, and I appreciate it both. Thank you. We've got a Q&A period, as was mentioned, so let's move it along. I took this picture in Kyiv in late May. Everybody know what this is? That's right, it's toilet paper. This answers the question, if any of you were wondering, okay? What Ukrainians
switch the slides.
What Ukrainians think.
Yeah, this one. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, one back.
We're going to go back. Oh, I hate it when this happens. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay. This is what Ukrainians think of Mr. Putin. And I had an opportunity to have several, dozens of different conversations with people in Kyiv and in the invasion corridor up around Bucha. this is really what they believe. Our problem, trying to accurately describe for today's discussions, we need some humility, and we need to start with some humility. Nobody has all the answers. Speaking only for myself, I don't feel all that eminent. I've been around wars for most of my adult life. The numbers of independent variables are at work in wartime are extraordinary. And nobody has all the answers. And we just need to keep that in mind. Quick war update. I'm going to get this right. Okay. This is the point I was trying to make. The only certainty in war is uncertainty, death, and terror. It's hard, it's difficult, and it damns everybody that tries to control it and stay on top of it. You needed a quick war update? Here it is. Putin's propaganda machine is in overdrive. For example, an invasion became a special military operation. The invader became the defender, and Ukrainians became Nazis who had to be eradicated. Putin hoped for a quick victory. He badly misjudged his adversary and his own military forces. 2,500 years ago, Sun Tzu, the brilliant Chinese general, wrote in the book, The Art of War, know your enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles you will never be in peril. Putin failed in all categories. So when his army was chewed up inside the initial invasion corridor, he changed his objective to the Donbass and the southern shores of the Black Sea. Russian military incompetence has been startling. Ask yourself a question, and my grandfather answered it. The rotting fish stinks from the head down. My grandfather was a smart man. My grandfather, he knew that corruption at the head of any hierarchical organization leads inevitably to corruption of the whole. Over more than 2 decades, the Russian political process, courts, business interests, and military have been brought to heel to serve the interests of one vainglorious individual, Putin. In military terms, Hitler was the center of gravity during World War II. His generals knew this and tried to kill him on more than one occasion. Had they been successful, the war might have ended much earlier, and millions of lives might have been spared. Putin is the center of gravity in this conflict. You wonder, does this photo capture the kind of pathological masculinity and strength Putin wishes to portray? I believe so. He relentlessly attempts to exude personal power while eschewing weakness of any sort. One wonders if Putin can distinguish any longer between the interests of the state and his own. He has reportedly amassed individual wealth in the many billions of dollars while peddling the narrative through the state propaganda machine that he's one of the last true Russian patriots. He is obsessed with the need to broadcast strength. Putin very well could be the poster boy for toxic masculinity. Paraphrasing, in my estimation, this story captured an essential truth of Russia today. It looks much like a mafia criminal organization. The Don in this case is Putin. The generals, oligarchs, and ministers, known in mafia circles as regimes and capos, all gorge themselves from the same trough, the natural resource wealth of the nation. Tragically, many of the oil and gas remittances coming from Europe are underwriting Putin. The czars of Russia used the nobility in similar fashion to gain and maintain control of the peasantry. Everything old is new again. This should come as no surprise to anybody in this group. There are 2 parts to this program. First, to manage the domestic population. That's very important for him personally. Second, to leverage the international community. Also very important to him personally. Up until this moment, up until the moment he made the decision to invade Ukraine, he was largely successful in his use of propaganda. Putin has created mountains of mendacities in his more than 2 decades in power. But like a cheating husband, lying to his wife about a secret mistress, the lies do eventually catch up. Putin has declared the number of Russian dead and wounded a state secret. Some lies cannot withstand even casual scrutiny. The U.S. Department of Defense conservatively estimates as many as 80,000 Russian dead and wounded at this time. Let me back up. That was the estimate in July. How many more now? I added this because William Burns, the current director of the U.S. CIA, is the former ambassador to Russia, undersecretary and deputy secretary of state. He personally knows Putin from over 2 decades of interactions. I included 3 of the most cogent comments that he made. Director Burns was also the last senior American official to meet with Putin prior to the invasion. Please note that Burns twice uses the word believe in the last 2 quotes. Belief is not fact-based, necessarily. Megalomaniacs always demonstrate a relentless belief in their own rectitude and often divorced from any objective reality. In psychiatric circles, this is known as a self-reinforcing delusion. The dilemma? The 19th century historian Lord Acton's wisdom was intended to be descriptive of papal authority. But the quote continues to resonate in the political arena even 150 years later. In my opinion, it helps us better understand Putin's current state of mind. This corruption leads inevitably to massive mistakes, and he's made them. The West's political challenges? This could be a very long list. I cherry-picked a few. Russian oil and gas shortages are on the near horizon because of Western sanctions. Will politicians fold when faced with freezing citizens? The US and EU politicians are currently in agreement. What happens if there's a change of US administrations? You may remember that shortly after Donald Trump was elected president of the United States, he tanked the Iran deal. Could something like that happen again? I don't know. Supporting Ukraine militarily is expensive. People are already complaining about it in the trenches. Some EU and US citizens might prefer the money to remain at home, leaving Ukraine to its fate. The last line, I believe, needs no further explanation. This one was funny when it happened to me. The time and effort required to ensure interoperability of both Finnish and Swedish forces is substantial. That's not an easy thing to do. If you were a soldier, you'd understand better, and we don't have time to go into it. However, it's not an easy thing to do. What happens if the war drags on and Donald Trump once again becomes president? We all know of the bromance he has with Putin. There's yet another wild card for the East. What will the US do if China invades Taiwan? How will that impact not only Europe, but the world? What if the conventional conflict spills over into an EU country? What if Russia strikes, even by accident, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe? What if Putin decides to engage the West asymmetrically? These are all great dangers and worries. If the director of the CIA can be believed, and I think him credible, Putin is cynical, corrupt, vengeful, and believes that his own fascist rhetoric. He and his key supporters recklessly imply possible nuclear use. You may know the Russians were the only ones talking about it. The Kremlin's more than 20-year master has a great deal in common with the Mafia Don, using coercion and extortion while controlling all the levers of national power. His twisted psychology and lack of empathy makes him difficult to anticipate. Also, it's important to point out that Putin becomes all the more dangerous if he comes to perceive that he's losing this war. I believe that the West has taken the correct course of action for both principled as well as self-interested rationales. Both Finland and Sweden voted with their feet by turning an about face and petitioning to join NATO. Only Putin could have made that happen. Russia under Putin is a continuing threat. If strength is the only quality that Putin respects, then the West must be strong. Once again, resolve matters. The Cold War went on for decades. Our resolve in that conflict eventually won the day. The West must also attempt to keep the war contained within Ukrainian borders. The American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, it's one of his key points to President Biden that the conflict must be contained within Ukrainian borders. If it starts to spill out, if the battle moves to Russia proper or expands toward the EU, the dangers associated with direct confrontation threaten everyone, everywhere. I need to present alternative views. They're both well-known, these two guys, you probably know them both. They're both well-known intellectuals from opposite sides of the political spectrum that are in rare agreement. Both seem to favor a hard-nosed, practical solution to the roots, or with roots, in the realist school of foreign affairs. Their failing, Kissinger and Chomsky, is that there is no morality in it. Do we wish to validate the utterly amoral notion that might is right? A friend of mine, also an adherent to the realist school, who reviewed this presentation a few weeks ago for me, reminded me of a 2,500-year-old quote from Thucydides, the father of military history. The strong do what they will, while the weak do what they must. And there's the provocation hypothesis. I've heard this a lot both in Washington, D.C. and in European capitals. This view is both morally bankrupt and just plain wrong, in my estimation. NATO is a purely defensive alliance. Putin knows this. Moreover, and again, 40 million people should not be held hostage to Putin's intimidation and coercion tactics. This smacks of the West's desertion of Eastern Europe in the wake of World War II that locked millions into the oppressive Soviet orbit. The fact is that liberal democracy simply threatens Putin's control. What happens if common people in Russia ever come to know the truth? There is no moral equivalency between the Kremlin's chief kleptocrat and the Western democracies. There is none. A French friend of mine. Yes, I have friends in France. I both agree and disagree with my friend's comment. First, my agreement. Europe is precisely where he said it is. Welcome home. And now where I disagree. Ukraine shares borders with the European Union nations. Putin's invasion is one of the very few actions that could have resulted in both Finland and Sweden requesting to join NATO. The law of unintended consequences has had its way. Only Putin could have compelled these fiercely independent nations to join the alliance, a major strategic blunder. The Soviet Union may indeed be dead, but Putin uses all the same tactics, techniques, and employment characteristics utilized by the commissars. Prominent among these are the big lie, first made famous by Hitler and his Jew-hating Reich Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. Putin fears Western liberal democracy and its emphasis on individual rights and the common good. With the singular exception of Belarus, the former Soviet vassal states are concerned. Will they be next? The source of Putin's war chest is Russia's vast natural resources. The Ukraine also possesses very considerable natural resources. Therefore, at least in significant part, his rationale for the invasion could be based in self-interest. There might be a self-interested rationale. I think there's lots of evidence to support it. I was asked to prognosticate. Fortune telling is more art than science, so please bear with me. I foresee a long conflict. Putin will not surrender Crimea. President Zelensky has declared he will not either. These positions are irreconcilable over a negotiating table. So I saw one of the questions that was submitted by this group about my hopes for diplomacy having a positive impact at this juncture. Not now. They will most likely have to be decided on the battlefield. The longer the war goes on, the opportunities for strategic miscalculation and tactical error multiply like rabbits on Viagra. What's the real reason for Putin to start this war? I was interviewed on Italian National Public Radio in July and asked this question. Putin views himself as the leader of a great country. He perceives the liberal democracies of Europe as threatening to his notion of control and order. The idea of a democratic Ukraine joining the European Union and eventually NATO is a threat to his historical legacy. Putin invaded Ukraine because he believes that it is Russia's long-term interest, the interest of not only himself, but his fantasy empire as well. Tragically, after more than 20 years in power, Putin can no longer discern the difference between the interests of the state and his own. Final thoughts? Putin is the progenitor of this war. He started it. It was a war of choice. He shares many characteristics in common with former czars and modern-day mafia dons. Given the tumult in current U.S. politics and the ever-growing threat from China over Taiwan, will America stay the course and remain a reliable ally against this threat? I don't know. I could have answered that some years ago, but no longer. Regrettably, I cannot give a definitive answer. If the conflict expands beyond the Ukraine, I can assure you that the possibilities for a larger war escalate rapidly. Although an imperfect analogy, Cold War realities have once again become our geostrategic benchmarks. Of course, these figures are from U.S. official sources and others, and must be viewed with a skeptical eye. The CIA director stated in late July that the Russians had as many as 15,000 dead and 3 times that number wounded. If any Russian official were to reveal the actual number, it would be punishable by 7 years in prison. In any case, those numbers have no doubt grown in August and September. However, if these figures are anywhere near the truth, these are horrifying losses in so short a period of time. What defines victory? And this is a question that Zelensky is asking himself as he goes to bed every night. The conflict has become an ugly war of attrition. Resolve. Resolve. Resolve is the only word that matters. It's the key element. A simple refusal to quit the fight. The war in Ukraine has retaught many of those in Europe and the US a hard lesson that it is people that win wars. The ultimate price is paid by the dead and maimed. As a reminder, this was very near my hotel. This is the wall in Kyiv. On a beautiful spring morning, I took a walk out to take a look at it. It has photographs of all the Ukrainians that they know that have been killed to date. I just wanted to remind everybody in the room that this is a conflict which is present, it's real, it's clear, and it's killing people not far from here. Thank you for time and attention. I appreciate it, and you didn't throw a brick at me, so.
Hey. Well, thank you, Robert Adolf, for your clear-cut observations, and I'm sure they evoke additional questions, but they have to wait, because first the floor is to Tony van der Tocht.
Thank you. Let's see. Whoop. Okay. Now, where is mine? close this one. Oh, oops. Always very bad at technology. Can somebody give me a hand?
I was used to working in Microsoft.
Okay, yeah, so you must be better at that.
This is
Just
an
to
Apple
put
device.
mine.
Getting started
Yeah,
on this.
okay. And then we
Blame Linda.
enlarge it. And then, yeah, okay. That's working. Thanks. And great thanks for having me. It's a big honor to be able to speak for the Dutch Atlantic Commission on this subject, which is, well, very close to my heart. As Paul already said, I'm back actually at Klingendahl on secondment from the MFA as a senior research fellow. After many years in Dutch diplomacy, working in and on this broader region, so with postings in Moscow, in Petersburg, and in Kazakhstan, and traveling widely in the region, and also over the years always trying to keep in touch with also Russian and Ukrainian colleagues and think tankers over there. And although this is very difficult now with Russian colleagues, we still try to do so, either with them online, if that's safe, or meeting them outside of Russia, like last summer in Istanbul. So some of my thoughts are also based on the information I get also from these sources, apart from my own broader research. What I would like to do is to focus not as much on Putin as a person, but on the Putin regime as such and how it works, and to ask some questions about how did it come to this war, and why now, and what are Putin's aims, and are there any changes in his war aims since he started this war in February? Well, that's me, you have already seen me. So this is basically what I would like to do within the time limits allotted to me, because the whole war has a lot to do with Russia's search for identity and status, especially in as far as this is connected to what Russia sees as its rightful place on the world stage, as Russia as a great power. This identity thing goes back to pre-communist times. It goes back basically to late Tsarist times, when they had this idea of autocracy, orthodoxy, and nation, something which defines Russia. And after the Soviet Union fell apart, they had a new search for a Russian idea. What is it to be Russian? What is it to be Russia? And this is very closely connected, as I already said, with this great power status, its rightful place as they see it on the world stage, which brings with it an inherent right to have a sphere of influence in what they see a multipolar global order, in which they, of course, have to be one of the poles apart from Washington and Beijing and maybe Brussels. And then Putin's war to re-establish a form of a Russian empire, not the Soviet Union, but a form of Russian empire. And that's what Putin was already referred to as a person. And I would like to link this to his dream to re-establish this Russian empire. And for that, he needs Ukraine. Because without Ukraine, it's not, in his view, it's not an empire anymore. So we'll come back to that. But I think two reasons for Putin to start a war now is one, that he may have had the idea that he was losing Ukraine, that Ukraine was drifting too much to the west, and that there was a kind of point of no return after which he would have lost it forever. And then the guy is turning 70. All the people around him, this small circle of people, mostly with a background in the security services or the armed forces, I mean, they're also about the same age, late 60, 70. So they want to do it now because they want this to be part of their historical legacy, or what they want to leave behind. So this is very much also a generational thing. First is identity. So And I will explain later what this means for the war. Because this is Russia based on, well, traditional values. It sets itself in opposition to liberal democratic values, to the universal validity of human rights. It has this whole Putinist system has posed itself, we have a sovereign democracy, which is, we have nothing to do with your forms of democracy. National law above international law, including on human rights. And even, well, quite recently now, Putin is saying, or the Kremlin has been saying, that they want to set up their own tribunal to judge Ukrainian war criminals. So it's completely, while denying, let's say, that international law, humanitarian law, also applies to them. So that there is something which is broader than Russia. We've seen this over a number of years now, that there has been this kind of civilizational turn in Russian politics, that Russia poses itself as a civilization, to which, in Putin's view, also Ukrainians and Belarusians belong. And that's where it's linked to this war. Because, and I completely agree with what the previous speaker has said, the biggest fear is not about NATO. So NATO is a nuisance for Russia because it hampers them in their power projection in Central and Eastern Europe. So it gives them less opportunities to make their neighbors do what they want. Including in what they call the near abroad, so the former Soviet countries which are in between us and them. The biggest fear is the fear of, let's say, this kind of revolutions from below, this kind of color revolutions. So this is Kiev, the Euromaidan Revolution of Dignity in 2014. These were some big demonstrations, but not really comparable in Moscow, 2011, 2012. But that is what Putin really is afraid of. And he sees the spread of liberal democracy, democratic values, as, let's say, a big plot by Washington with the help of European states to foster regime change, basically, in Yugoslavia, in the former Soviet states, in the Arab world with the Arab Spring. So they see it as one big conspiracy, which, in their view, inevitably has to end or to target Moscow. So they're afraid that they would have to see this Euromaidan on Red Square. And that is something they would like to prevent by all means. And this means that they have been building a kind of fortress Russia, a more isolationist Russia, which does not depend on the West or on outside partners in as far as this is possible in a globalized world. So they first went for the political isolation, to make sure that those in opposition or those who share liberal or democratic values inside Russia are isolated, marginalized, put in jail, or had to flee abroad. They also tried to somehow shield their economy in as much as this was possible from overly dependent on the outside world. So they have been working on what they call a kind of sovereign economy, to work on a sovereign information space, a Russian form of internet, Runet, and protecting, in all of this, protecting these cultural values as Putin sees them as a security concern. That may seem very strange to you, but when part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church split off from Moscow and got its own independent autocephalous Orthodox Church, Putin called a meeting of the National Security Council. Well, I don't see Mark Rutte, when there is another split in somewhere in the Protestant churches in the Netherlands, to to put this on the agenda of the Council of Ministers. But Putin sees this as a threat to this Russian world, to this these traditional values, which in his view also apply to Ukraine and Ukrainians. What we've also seen, we had a lot of talk in the past about modernization of the Russian economy. Well, in fact, it remains a kleptocratic business model, mostly based on the export of energy and raw materials. And, well, now also, partly because of the war, there is a discussion in Russia also going on, maybe to also withdraw from the World Trade Organization, which fits in the broader pattern of withdrawing from this international rules-based order. And you have already seen that while Russia has withdrawn from the Council of Europe, the European Court of Human Rights, they already said a few years ago that Russian constitutional law is above above international law, so they could already deny the validity of verdicts of the European Court of Human Rights if they would wish so. So they don't accept a lot of other international legal obligations, including parts of the competence of the International Court of Justice, the ICC, ITLOS, the Tribunal of the Law of the Seas, which we saw in the Netherlands when we went to that tribunal about the Greenpeace ship, the Rainbow Warrior, which was unlawfully arrested by Russia in 2013. But then Russia said, no, we don't agree. This doesn't apply. Same with forms of international arbitration. UCOS is a point in case. And so this is a trend. This is something bigger. So Russia withdrawing, some people have called it Ruxit, so Russia withdrawing from this international order, the international legal order, the rules-based order. And it's very difficult now to answer the question, what still applies? I mean, Russia has violated many treaties, including with Ukraine, bilateral treaties, multilateral treaties. Do they feel still bound by anything at all? And that figures into their view of a great power, can Russia as a great power simply say, well, might is right. If we can get away with it, we can get away with it. So we simply do whatever we want or what we see as in our national interest. Because this is the other part of the story. So Putin sees Russia as a re-emerging great power with an inherent right to have a sphere of influence, especially in the near abroad, so those countries in between us and them. And in the same sense, he sees Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians as one nation, which he explained last year in a big historical essay, saying, well, Ukraine has never been a state, it's artificial. All those treaties which were signed before, somehow don't apply anymore. And they're one nation. And you see this also now, actually, during the war in Ukraine, that in occupied territories, Ukrainians are forced to take Russian passports, something which we already saw before in other areas, including in the Donbass. And if they don't want to, they can be deported, as many have already been deported into Russia, or they are simply killed. So all to deny the statehood and the nationhood of Ukraine, which in my view gets very close to indications of an ongoing genocide. So if you really deny the existence of a nation of Ukrainians, and you act on that, that gets very close, and it's more for international lawyers to discuss how close, whether it gets close enough, but in my view it really does. So this all fits into this Putin's idea of a Russian world, and in his view, Russia has the inherent right to protect Russian citizens, as he called them. They may officially not be Russian citizens, they may be citizens of Ukraine or of Georgia or of other former Soviet states, but that they have the right, and that's also in Russian policy documents, that they have the right to protect them abroad, even if necessary, by military means. So it's Russia's own form of responsibility to protect. And just this Monday, Putin signed another decree approving a new concept basically of Russian foreign policy, but concentrating a lot on this Russian world and Russians living abroad. Just to remind you, he said, well, the falling apart of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And he wants to put this right, in his view. And the ideal world, in Russia's ideal world, is this. It's a kind of new Yalta, where the great powers decide among themselves who has which sphere of influence. And it has nothing to do with, I think, international law or all the things we had in the OEC, in the CSE, and other international agreements which we made and on which we built this security order which we thought we had in Europe and which would, in our view, had to secure peace. So Putin wants to re-establish this Russian world, and he was once asked, what are the borders of this Russian world? And Putin says, well, Russian world has no borders. And that ties in very nicely with his view that Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians are one nation, and wherever Russians live or feel Russian or feel part of this culture, they are his. They're his people. And in this sense, he wants to rewrite history. This is, the National Security Council, which was broadcast on Russian television, and which he wanted to make the members of the National Security Council complicit in what he was going to do, to recognize first, as a first step, the independence of the Donbass or the DNR and LNR separatist entities. And just to go back to just a quote from Zbigniew Brzezinski, because Russians have been discussing geopolitics over very many years. And books like by Henry Kissinger or Zbigniew Brzezinski are all translated into Russian. If you walk into a Russian bookshop, you can see a whole shelf of these kind of books. And this is something from the Grand Chessboard, influential book many years ago. Some of you might have read it, by Zbigniew Brzezinski. In which he said that, Ukraine, a new and important space on the Eurasian chessboard, is a geopolitical pivot because its very existence as an independent country helps to transform Russia. Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a Eurasian empire. And this is very much in the back of Putin's mind. This is what he wants to prevent. And then this is more or less the result of what you give. This is one of the latest from the Institute of the Study of War, where we stand now. And some of the areas where the actual fighting is going on, they somehow coincide with what in the 19th century was the Russian province during the Russian Empire of so-called Novorossiya. And also in 2014, there was a lot of talk among Russians, we have to re-establish this Novorossiya. Then later it went away. But when you see the actual lines of fighting, this is not only Donbass, this is about much more. It's about the connection to Crimea, and if it is not stopped, it can, cover the whole southern coast of Ukraine, and maybe even further. So that's one of the big questions. If we can't stop this, where will it stop? So keeping in mind also Putin's idea of, the Russian world, which has no borders. Russia relations, I will be very brief on that. We can come back in the discussion with that. One of our policy aims has been to isolate now Russia as much as possible politically, to make sure that the sanctions work, that other countries do not assist Russia in dodging the sanctions. Especially the fact that the extra territorial effects of US sanctions, especially financial sanctions, make the Chinese think twice before they really assist Russia in this matter. So, I mean, the Chinese support is very often, well, said to be, well, an important factor for Russia, something which can help them. But I have my doubts on that, and so do some of our China experts. Of course, the role of Turkey, we can discuss some, well, very difficult balancing, hedging, trying to play mediator, being a member of NATO, and at the same time trying to work out deals like on the grain exports, or being involved with the UN Secretary General, the deal in Zaporozhye, the main nuclear power plant. Africa also important because, well, they're also hit especially by the lack of grain exports. And this is the chairman of the African Union coming to Putin and trying to persuade him to find some form of solution. And that is something we also from the European side have to keep in mind, that this is another battle. It's a battle for the hearts and minds of the global South, which is important. It's important to convince countries in Africa that this is not purely a European war. I mean, we also sometimes have trouble convincing people here that this is also our war, because where otherwise, if it's not stopped, where will it end? It will somehow directly also affect us. But it's also for countries in Africa, and I just yesterday discussed it also with the Ukrainian strategists, we have to reach out to the countries concerned, take their own concerns very much into consideration, trying to help them, because in some areas they may depend on Russia, but also making sure that things like assisting actively Russia to dodge sanctions will not be tolerated. It could have consequences also for our relations with them. And to present in strategic communication this war not as a purely European war or war on the European continent, but as Ukraine sees it, as also a decolonization war. So they see themselves very much as a colony. And this may bring, it may be in Africa, this may be considered as well. Yeah, you have a point. You're fighting the same kind of wars we have been fighting in the past as well. Some of the last points I want to throw up, and partly, well, I'm not going to answer all of these things. It's also basically for the discussion. What we do know is that the war is a watershed moment. And this is not only about Ukraine, it's about the European security order, and maybe even wider. It's important for Russia itself and for its relations with the outside world. So where do Russia belong? What will come of this dream of a Russian world? And there are, of course, several outcomes that, well, takes Donbass or go back to the borders of before the 24th of February. But all of these kind of things, which somehow look like a kind of Minsk III agreement, a temporary ceasefire and no real political solution. I think that all of these things are only temporary, because Putin plays for the highest stakes. So if there is a kind of ceasefire or whatever, it only helps both sides, I think, to rearm, re-equip, concentrate again, and then the whole war will start up again. So as long as this Putin regime is in place, I think no real diplomatic solution, peaceful solution is possible.
It's a good fight.
2 words. So, the question is then, is this the end of the Putin regime? I mean, can he sustain this regime also internally? What are we going to do with, the Russians, let's say the good Russians who fled abroad? How are we going to have, as long as Putin is there, can we still have kind of return to business as usual? And we have the big matter of accountability. And here in the Netherlands, we are discussing a lot about the war crimes, and that those responsible for that have to be tried by a tribunal or otherwise. Is Russia going to pay also partly for the reconstruction of Ukraine? I mean, after all, everything they did, Or will we have to deal with a humiliated, revanchist Russia like a kind of, well, Germany in the after the Weimar Republic? Are we facing a new Cold War in Europe? And where do countries then belong and end up? And how do we deal with the neutral states, and especially the ones in the global south? Okay.
Thank you.
That's enough for the moment.
Well, thank you, Tony, for this solid analysis, which also gives food for discussion. So let me kick off with a few questions of my own. Robert Adolph, first of all, let me ask you a straightforward question as a former military man. How do you assess the present state on the battlefield? I mean, to what extent is the Ukrainian offensive, for example, a success?
The Ukrainians are winning. Putin is losing. By every metric I know, every military metric, as a strategist I know, the Ukrainians are winning. It looks more like stasis, but winning is tied to resolve. You don't have to go any further than the recent war in Afghanistan and look at the Taliban. The Americans might have defeated the Taliban in every battle, and yet they won. Over a period of 20 years, they won. There's no morality in this, they just won. They won because they had the necessary resolve. So as I said in my presentation, Ukraine wins by refusing to lose. Also, it's a country of 40 million people. One other thing, even before the war started, knowing that it was possible, the American Special Forces, of which I am a proud member, was actually engaged in training Ukrainian military in something called resistance operations. Those resistance operations have been seen, most recently, successful in Crimea, essentially attacking the Russians behind their own lines, where they are extraordinarily vulnerable. One more thing. The Russians have demonstrated an incredible, an extraordinary amount of incompetence. Their largely conscript army, their use of the Chechens, of the Wagner military, the mercenaries, is all of that of desperation. Now, can Russia continue the fight for a while? Yes, they can. And they no doubt will, so long as Putin lives. Mm-hmm. Did I answer your question, sir?
Sure. Now, it's obvious that Putin misjudged the resolve of the Ukrainians. You said he also misjudged the resolve of the West.
Yes.
But maybe his gamble from the beginning was that it is a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, maybe the resolve of the West will slowly erode. And maybe some signs of that we are witnessing some signs of that right now.
Part yes, part no. The no part first. Recent intelligence, some of the reading I've done, and I was formerly an intelligence officer, I still know a lot of people in the business. They've all essentially told me pretty much the same thing. We knew what Putin was going to do. Joe Biden actually took the extraordinary event and made sure that President Zelensky knew that this was going to happen. Zelensky chose not to believe it. Now, that's a lack of imagination, but a lack of imagination lots of people suffer from. So, I believe that Putin actually massively misjudged. In terms of strategies, strategies are defined in terms of ends, ways, and means, but analyzed in terms of suitability, feasibility, and acceptability. Putin did in Ukraine exactly what the Americans failed to do in Afghanistan. Essentially failed in all three areas. Now, these were political decisions. George W. Bush made the decision to go into Afghanistan and fight a second war in Iraq. Putin, for his case, with different intents, but the result was the same, is going to end up in a loss. The question is how much damage he can do in the meantime. In May, I was inside the invasion corridor that was used initially by the Russians to try and get to Kyiv. The Ukrainians blew all the bridges. So I drove right by them on the road up to Chernobyl. Okay, all the bridges had been destroyed. So the Russians were caught in a bottleneck and piecemeal destroyed. Putin hasn't made a good move yet.
Okay. Tony, you used the word a watershed moment in European history or in world history. Do you think that the West is really up to recognizing this? So I'm actually asking the same question. What are your thoughts about the resolve of the West?
Well, we still see a lot of resolve. The big question is, will it last also this winter? If the cost on our side will go up. There will be a lot of, also if we want to stay the course, it is very important for the communication of Western governments to explain to the broader public why this is necessary. And that we do not want to be the next or to have a bigger war, and that is what is threatening us if Putin is allowed to go on and deny everything, to violate all the treaties, and to go on with his aggression till the very end. I think we will have to keep the resolve. I think also in the European Union, a lot is now being discussed on how to mitigate some of the negative effects, let's say in the energy sphere or otherwise. We will. I mean, I think that this conflict, this war, will go on for some more time. This is also very much a matter of explaining, communicating why we have to keep on supporting Ukraine militarily in the humanitarian field, and that this is not something which is going to end anytime soon, and it will have costs also on our side. But it's important enough to keep up.
Are you satisfied with the way European leaders perform this task of explaining what is at stake?
Well, it depends on several countries, and some countries are better in it than others. But in general, I think Putin was surprised by the resolve, first on the sanctions, then on the extent of the sanctions, on the unity of, not only the EU, but also transatlantically, NATO, in the G7. So I think he had not really... that was one of the big miscalculations he made. So he thought that, especially with the energy weapon, he would be able to divide Europe and divide the Atlantic Alliance. And in that matter, he failed. But then, I mean, he also failed because I think what he originally had in mind was a kind of blitzkrieg, taking over Kiev, putting up his own puppet regime, and then, I mean, surprising all of us, and in 2 weeks' time it would be over, and then he found out that he was misinformed and there was no plan B. Exactly. So I think this is something he will also be struggling with, about resolve on the Russian side. Because, a lot of Russians, especially the younger generation, more than 300,000, maybe up to 500,000, have already left. Okay, he can put the opposition in jail. Economic sanctions are hurting, and hurting more and more. And gradually, I mean, the Russian public will also come to realize the costs for Russia, also in human terms. People are dying. And that is a dilemma. You can try to keep that out of the media, and media are very controlled in Russia. But eventually it will get through, and people will start realizing the costs and thinking about, well, is this really worthwhile?
Okay, conventional wisdom, of course, is that Russians really can suffer.
Well, they can suffer a bit more, but I mean, there have, especially the younger generation in the bigger cities, there has been kind of rising expectations that life would gradually become better. And now they see the opposite. So this original social contract which was there with the Russian people, if you stay out of politics, I will secure more welfare and all of that, that's not happening anymore. So he has to fall back on things like propaganda and repression. Okay, you can keep that up for some time, but not forever. And then this generational thing, I think, is very important. I mean, how long are these 60, 70-year-olds going to carry on? And do they have the resolve to do so? Because, well, in the end, you will see cracks in the Russian political elite. Some of the cracks are already showing. And when you saw, for example, when Putin was on this very long table with his Minister of Defense and Chief of General Staff, and he said, well, you had to work on the preparedness of the nuclear forces. You have to go up one stage more, one stage higher. You could see from the body language that these people don't really like it. And also with this picture which I showed for the National Security Council on television, and he called all these people forward, and you could see that some people really didn't like what he was doing, but somehow they couldn't stop him. They don't have this power in this Byzantine power structures of the Kremlin. But there will be a moment that also maybe Russian generals will say, well, enough is enough. This is getting nowhere. The whole army is falling apart. It's going down the drain, and we're not going to do this. Yeah. So I hope for some clear minds who think a little bit further than their own present position, and who may at a certain time challenge Putin and say, well, this we can't go on like this.
Talking about the Kremlin, you can only guess what Putin would think of this table.
Yeah, it's too small.
Robert Adolf, are you, as an American observer, impressed with European leadership?
Yes. In large measure, I think the European Union has responded appropriately. I've lived in Europe for some time, and in multiple different countries. I've visited most of the countries, most of the capitals of the EU. You have differences of opinion, understandably so. The European Union did not stand up in a day. However, in response to a clear and present danger presented by Putin's invasion, I think the EU has acted with extraordinary unanimity. And I think even the Americans that I've spoke to across the pond in Washington, D.C., have been pleasantly surprised. I know, because I know what they say in Washington, D.C. about Europe. But I also know what the Europeans say about the Americans in Washington, D.C. There is broad agreement and a broad understanding on the part of both the United States and Europe that Putin presents a clear and present threat to what we can call, I suspect, the international liberal democratic order.
All right. Let me now turn to the audience. Who would like to ask a question? And let me ask to state your name and, if relevant, your organization. And please abstain from comments, or at least hide your comment in a question. Sir, over there.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Niels Lafsta. Thank you very much to the speakers for your introductions. I've got a question about the way ahead, the strategic way ahead. I think we probably agree that we need not only a military strategic approach to end the war, but also primarily a grand strategic approach. So we have known hybrid warfare from the Russians over the last decades, and some have warned already in the past that Russian gas could be used as a weapon, and we didn't have the right answer. So today we see that Putin has indeed a strategy of divide and rule by weaponizing gas, and this leads to the question, how effective are our economic sanctions? Is a boycott of fossil energy, for instance, not counterproductive, leading to hyperinflation and social unrest on our side, and more income for Putin due to rising prices?
Okay, thank you. Tony?
Yeah, very good questions. I think, the effectiveness of sanctions, you have to divide it into short-term and long-term. The short-term effects are, Russia is very much hurt by, for example, technological sanctions. In the energy sphere, in some areas, prices have gone up and Russia is even getting more, but this is a kind of temporary thing. They would love to have China as a client instead of the EU, but you cannot build all kind of pipelines overnight into that direction. So that is for Russia no real big alternative. And you have, at the moment what they are doing is they're selling oil, for example, with huge discounts to India and China. But there you also have the problems of, for example, the shipping. It depends also on the measures we take about shipping, about insurance, because insurance costs will go up. Shipping can also be blocked in several cases. So it's not a complete boycott, but loopholes are closing. And gradually in Europe, there are alternative sources with LNG, with other areas of the world. Maybe not as much as in the short term, not as much as to completely replace Russian resources. But still, it can carry us over this period when I think eventually Putin will be forced to come to some kind of withdrawal, or the system is going to collapse inside Russia because of this internal conflicts inside Russia itself. Nobody knows how long this will take, of course, but at the moment I think there is no real alternative to staying the course. And a number of these sanctions are going to hurt more and more as long as time goes by.
Okay, Bob, do you have an additional comment?
The only thing I would add is on the military side, okay? And people have a tendency, because we think in these terms, this is the vernacular, military, political. No, okay? They must be combined. That's the way it works. National power is defined in terms of, yes, the military, economic, informational, and diplomatic. These are all levers of national power. The West, defined by you and the Americans, thus far, are using all the levers of power. So when I answer this question, okay, in terms of sanctions, in the short term, sanctions are not going to work. In the long term, they very well may, which I think supports Tony's notion. So back to the word that I was using during my presentation. It's all about stick-to-itiveness. It's all about resolve. It's all about deciding this is the course we're going to set, and then stay that course. If we do, we succeed. If we don't, perhaps not.
Okay.
Frank Turnus. I'm a member of the D66 Defense Network. D66, that's Liberal Democrats. My question is the following. We know that dictatorships that lose wars are usually not headed for a glorious future. Case in point I want to mention is in the Falklands War, not a single British soldier set foot on Argentinian soil, but the junta didn't survive the defeat in the Falklands. So Putin doesn't, or rather the Ukrainians don't have to invade Russia to make Putin lose the war. Consequences for the people involved are usually not very pleasant. The novelty in this case is that the incumbents have access to nuclear weapons. So if you define risk as probability times consequences, this is a high risk scenario. And the question is, how do we deal with that?
Go back to the realist school of foreign affairs, the realist schools of military. You have to take the nuclear issue, and I would remind everyone, it's not just nuclear. The Russians used chemical warfare in Syria. Thank God they haven't, to my knowledge, engaged in biological warfare to date. But they have capabilities in all three areas, which is exactly why I mentioned previously during my presentation that the war has to be kept inside the confines, inside the borders of the Ukraine. And again, this was mentioned by General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the primary military advisor to the President of the United States. It must be kept contained. And I have no doubt that this conversation has already taken place with President Zelensky. Now, would Zelensky be happy about this? That only the Ukrainians are going to suffer from this. Imagine if you were President Zelensky and told, I'm sorry, this battle is between the West fears of the possibility of nuclear conflagration and the ambitions of a vainglorious dictator in Moscow. My fear, this is a fear I think we all have, you don't have to go back very far, World War II, and look at one leader did to Germany. His own generals tried to kill him on more than one occasion and failed. Hitler was the center of gravity in that conflict. If the Allies had managed to somehow assassinate Hitler, they would have ended that war much earlier and saved millions of lives and massive destruction on a scale that this continent had never seen previously, and I hope never will be seen again. I share all of those fears you were talking about. The only thing I can hope for is that cooler heads in the Kremlin will eventually prevail. And I think Tony mentioned the possibility that somebody or some bodies, and I suspect it would have to be within his own government and within his own military, who make the determination that we're losing, and we're losing big, and it's just not worth it anymore. If they take him out all by themselves, if the German generals were successful in taking Hitler out, it would have ended the conflict much sooner.
Okay. Tony, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there are different scenarios, of course, possible. The least likely is a kind of democratic revolution in Russia. At least not at this very moment, especially since very many of these people who would have supported this are now abroad, so they had to flee the country. So indeed, it has to come from inside the regime, kind of split in the regime, that people who are opposed to this course, who see that this is going really nowhere, this is only bringing disaster to Russia itself, and that they would do something about it. And whether this is going to be a palace coup or whatever, there are all kind of possibilities. And of course, I mean, it's escalation is always a big danger. But well, like you said, I hope, cool heads will prevail. But there is also a possibility, and we should start thinking about this, that we may face a situation like 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, that Russia would actually fall apart along certain regional lines. We don't know, and we are not going to say that we are going to promote any of this, but if this happens inside Russia because of power dynamics in Russia, then we have to be prepared on how to respond to that. And one one thing is indeed, like in 1991, what will happen to the nuclear weapons, which are then suddenly in several new entities.
But aren't you saying that it's all beyond our control? We have absolutely no influence at all on this?
Now, basically, the influence we have is because of, well, the effects of the sanctions, the support we give to Ukraine, Russia not winning, and as long as Russia is not winning, basically they are losing, at least in Putin's terms. But we don't have an other influence inside Russia. So we are not going to bring about a regime change or anything like that. That will have to come from inside Russia. But Russians will see that because of the sanctions, because of what Putin did, and because of the war and the way it's going, and that he is not successful, that will bring about the idea that something has to be done. But they have to do it.
Now, a mere 2 or 3 weeks after the beginning of the invasion, President Macron said Russia should not be humiliated. Is that the right attitude? Is that a correct statement?
I think Putin is humiliating himself. I mean, it's not what we are doing. It's not of our doing.
Right. Another question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Tom Malone, with the board of the Atlantic Commission. The comment about milis trying to keep this in the Ukraine. First of all, I think that's only the military part.
Yeah.
The economic part can also contain it to the Ukraine only, because Russia is going to open or whatever we do with Ukraine. But the other thing which I would like to really come back to the nuclear question. Now suppose Putin army, he's losing badly, he's buying ammunition from North Korea, by the way.
Yeah.
So the sanctions actually do work. Maybe not the money sanctions, but the buying, he can't buy it.
Yeah.
But the point is here, now suppose when this army gets more and more humiliated, and he uses a nuclear weapon within Ukraine, he nukes here. What do you think is going to happen then?
Tony, you want to get that? Okay.
Both of you?
All right.
First of all, the military.
You're killing me. Yeah. The American military, I was a soldier for 26 years. We had to deal with the possibility. We had to think about it. We had to be able to imagine the possibility that we would live in a world of tactical nuclear weapons. And we hope we're only talking about, look, I'm using the word hope, and I'm only talking about tactical nuclear weapons that have a relatively low yield and will only destroy half a city instead of a whole city. Only kill 250,000 people instead of 500,000 people. And this is what I'm hoping for, if anything like that were ever to occur. Only the military, generally speaking, and those civilians that specialize in nuclear affairs have even given this much thought. It's horrifying. And that kind of horror freezes your mind. And what happens after that? Nobody actually knows. Anyone who says, we have a plan for this, go ahead. Please execute your plan. The numbers of independent variables at work in that scenario are extraordinary. Nobody knows what happens after that. Nobody. And that's what I'm afraid of.
Do you want to add?
Yeah, of course, that is a scenario in which, well, people think about it. What if? I think it is not a big probability that this is going to happen. Okay, in Russian military strategy, you have something like the demonstrative use of a tactical nuclear weapon to indicate that you're now coming close to Russian red lines, and Russia itself has to be protected. But I don't think we are there. I think also the US has been doing a lot of communication, at least I hope, also behind closed doors, that this will have serious consequences if they consider using a nuclear weapon or biological or chemical. And I don't really think, what would Putin win because of this? I mean, if he wants to control Ukraine, to have this nuclear weapon, and then what? You own a nuclear wasteland, or so. I don't think this is only in very extreme circumstances when Russia itself may be threatened. Then this could be some kind of possibility. But then I also think that there will be generals or there will be people who really don't see the advantage in also going this step on the escalation ladder. And then indeed that also then cooler heads may prevail.
I want to add a caveat. Tony just gave a perfect rationalist explanation. Everyone in this room, I hope, is a rational actor. I hope none of you are psychopathic or pathological or neurotic, suffering from any other maladies of the mind. However, your rational analysis fails and breaks down, and I've done this for years as an intelligence officer. It's the key mistake that lots of intelligence officers, the CIA, make, because they're Americans. They grew up in America. Most of them are rationalists.
Yeah.
They're just like you. However, when you're confronted with an adversary who is not rational, again, the geostrategic threats multiply like bunnies on Viagra. And where it goes, nobody knows.
All right.
Yep.
Next question in the back. Yes.
Joanna van der Merwe.
Oh, can you speak up a little?
Yeah, I'll try. Joanna van der Merwe, the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C., and also a fellow at the Futures International Strategy Forum. So I have a question. Obviously, it's kind of like looking into a magic 8 ball about the future. Obviously, we face the 2024 elections in the US, which in and of itself could cause a divide within Western powers. And an assumption that what comes next after Putin is better. I'm a fourth generation Eastern European. I'm the fourth generation to watch family members die at the hands of Russian aggression, and constantly hearing the assumption that what comes next is better doesn't exist in my mind. And so my question is when you're talking about the long-term sanctions, if you look at the history of a country humiliated, what is created as a breeding ground for extremism and radicalization in any form. So this assumption that the next generation who are left in Russia will have the strength or be better, I think is, for me, hard to grasp. So I was wondering how you, as the experts who've seen this historical growth, can give advice for what we need to do in the future, considering we face divisions in ourselves, but also the breeding ground for radicalization in Russia itself.
Okay, Tony?
Yeah, you mentioned the younger generation, and this is indeed partly a generational thing. What we assumed in the past was very often that after Putin everything will be better. Well, this is not necessarily going to be the case, because there are also a lot of young people who are, well, somehow maybe for career reasons or whatever, are buying into this Russian narrative, are trying to make the best of it. But not all of them. So what we have seen over time, also when you look at demonstrations, in as far as they were still possible, that those on the streets were becoming younger and younger. So there is this kind of, there is a generation of people who have access to the internet, but also to broader sources. And even if now, I mean, officially Facebook is forbidden, this is forbidden, I mean, a lot of them have VPNs and they can still access all kind of other sources. Question is what they do with it, whether they really want to get to that information. I know that inside Russia, generations, it's not only generations, it's families also, which are very much divided internally. And a lot, I mean, have left Russia, are now in the Baltic states, or they are as independent journalists in Amsterdam, broadcasting from there, are in Turkey, are in Georgia, Armenia. And I still think that somehow this is Russia's best hope, that when the regime falls, these people can go back and work towards a more, maybe it's a pipe dream, and especially when you are from Eastern Europe, you have fully the right to be skeptical about this. But I hope that there are people, and in Russia, well, they're now called, they're called westernizers, or they are the fifth column. So they're marginalized, they're repressed, they're sent abroad. But I hope that they are the best hope for another Russia, for a kind of more democratic Russia, a non-imperialist Russia. And of course, I mean, at the moment, Ukrainians don't believe in that. For them, all Russians are complicit. They're not rising up to Putin. So they don't want to talk to them, and in principle, they can all be killed. In this situation, I can understand that, but I think that on our side, we must be open to working with this Russian opposition and independent journalists abroad, that we should welcome them, that we should support them here. And of course, it's like we are doing with Belarusians, so giving our support to Tikhanovskaya, to the opposition. And well, there is, for some time now, there's not too much we can do to change the internal situation, but in the end, this internal situation will change because of internal dynamics, and then we hope that these people can go back and be part of another Russia.
All right, there's time for one more question. Please, go ahead.
Marianne Kopier, local staff member at the US Embassy. You mentioned a couple times that winning this war is all about resolve, and I agree. So what if scenario involving China, what if China invades Taiwan? What do you think that will do for transatlantic resolve, and particularly public support?
The Americans are very interesting nationality. I'd call them bipolar. The Americans are, wouldn't you agree, Tony? The Americans have a degree of bipolarity. Okay, so on one side, the American patriots and the American Democrats and the American freedom lovers are going to get behind Taiwan. They're going to get behind Taiwan. And at the same time, if Ukraine gets really ugly, you're kind of ugly, okay? I think the Americans are going to hang in. I think they're going to hang in. And I think they're going to hang in because, being one of them, I probably know them a little bit better. I don't see them doing anything but staying the course, with a caveat. There's always a caveat, isn't there?
Always is.
There's always a caveat. You take a wild card like Donald Trump. Let's say, for example, Donald Trump is elected president of the United States in 2024. It's the only way he's going to escape prison. Okay? The only way he's going to escape prison is to be elected president. At least to put it up, maybe his dream is to die in office, and at least he stays out of prison. If that happens,
President for life.
yeah, I don't know. There are a significant proportion of American citizens right now who are not, in my view, rational. They're governed by grievance. We were talking about this earlier, Brian. And that grievance seems to wipe out everything else. There are groups within that right-wing movement who would let Ukraine fall. And might take a look at China and say, no, the real enemy is China. Now, would Donald Trump likely do that? I mean, we do know that Donald Trump and Putin have had this long-term bromance, and that there's nothing that Putin has ever done that Trump didn't applaud to. That's the wild card. And that's why I mentioned the lack of rationality earlier, and how many intelligence analysts and politicians, and I'm sorry, everyone in this room, who are all rationalists, okay, and would never push a button to send a nuclear weapon downrange. Nobody in this room would do that. There are people that would. I assure you, there are people that would. I've met them. I've sat across tables from them. They are pathological. They are sociopathic. And they're some of the most dangerous people in the world.
Okay. Tony, final words?
Yeah, well, in this case, I also hope that cooler heads may prevail. Like the big boys in the room when Trump just entered office for the first time. So I hope that some rationality will, in the end, prevail here.
All right. Time is up. We've covered a lot of ground. We've also left some ground barren, but it's unavoidable. Some people have sent in questions in advance, and I apologize for not asking them if they are sent in, but I think most of them are answered by our discussion. We had a very serious discussion about a serious matter, so permit me to end on a somewhat lighter note. Mark Twain once said, "God created war so that Americans could learn geography." Well,
There's some truth to that.
well, let me assure you that it doesn't apply to you, and certainly not to you either. Thank you for your interesting and insightful observations. Thank you for your attention, and I want to acknowledge one person in particular because this public meeting is the last of maybe almost the last of very many public meetings organized by Bram Boxhorn as director of the Atlantic Association. So please give him a hand.